Welcome to the Fulcrum Democracy Forum. I'm Ulubarta, Executive Editor with the Fulcrum, a daily cross-partisan news publication that engages citizens in evolving government to better meet the needs of all people. To that end, we strive to share many perspectives to widen our readers' viewpoints. For this episode, I'm joined by Stephanie Toliver, an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction focusing on English education and adolescent secondary literacy. Welcome to the program, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, your work focuses on three main areas, including investigating Black storytelling as a social critique and transformation mechanism. Tell us about that and the other points of emphasis of your work.
So I think one of the main things in my work is that I am an artist and I'm a nerd. And so a lot of my work stems from those two things that are part of who I am. And so the first part is investigating Black storytelling as this mechanism of social critique and transformation. And my aim in that is to really underscore the role of narrative in social critique and transformation. So showcasing how storytelling as this culturally and critically informed literacy practices can help to expose injustices, but also inspire new paradigms for equity and liberation. And so in that work, I do a lot of just talking to Black people about their stories, their histories, their lives, their experiences, and listening for those spaces where we talk about the negative or unjust experiences that we have, but also like, how do we imagine outside of that? How do we dream of better futures? How do we create those new futures for ourselves? And so that's the first strand. The second strand of my research is examining the applicability of speculative fiction. So that's science fiction, horror, fantasy, any of those stories that go outside of our everyday reality, as a tool to assist Black young people in articulating and challenging social justice. And so in that work, I work with between 8th through 12th graders to write speculative stories to talk about their worlds. I do a lot of, like I said, storytelling and art. And so this is my way of kind of talking to young people about what they're experiencing, what they're thinking about, and in a way that's not like, I don't ever want to come to a young person and say, tell me about your sadness. Tell me about, like, I don't want to do that work. But I think that in talking to them about what do they see that's wrong in the world and how would they fix it, we start to think about what might happen. Think about the impossibilities. Think about the future and what if and what might be instead of what is. And so that's what I try to work with young people about. And then the last strand is really exploring the use of creative and arts-based literacy pedagogies to help pre-service English teachers develop strategies to address injustice in their future classrooms. And so I am a teacher educator and I teach future English teachers. And one of the things that often happens is, as an English major, a lot of your work is reading like Shakespeare or Gatsby or Steinbeck or something like that. And I think that's wonderful for them to do. But I also think that we have to get out of this idea that reading only specific things equates to literacy, equates to reading and writing. And so I bring in things to help us think beyond. So I bring in art supplies, we draw, we color, we write stories, we create poetry to really think about how we might do English education differently.
I want to go back to the part that you mentioned about storytelling and how important it is, especially with marginalized communities, to be seen and heard and have the opportunity to tell those stories that are too often absent from mainstream media. Are there any particular stories or a story that you can share that really stands out?
There's one that it just sticks with me. So, this person, as a woman, she is in her 60s, and we were talking about schooling, and she was talking about how, um, she went to the school that was on the Black side of town and the elementary school, and she wore her Easter dress to class because it was pretty and she was all excited. And it was like a hoop dress. So, like when you sit down, it kind of floofs up. And so she sat down in her chair and she put the hoop around the back of it so it didn't floof up so she could sit directly on the seat. And the teacher came up to her and like smacked her on the back and told her to fix her dress. And she was so like distraught. She was like, I don't know what I did wrong. I want to say she said first grade or second grade. And so she was like, I didn't know what I did wrong, but I knew I was doing something bad, but I didn't know. And she got home and her mom saw her, like she was just distraught, like just really like not understanding what the issue was. And her mom gives her a hug and she turns her around and on her back was a handprint. So the teacher had hit her so hard that there was a handprint on her back. And so her mom went down to the school and was like, "What is going on?" Um, and the teacher was just like, "Well, she shouldn't have, worn that dress to school. She should have done something differently." And so what that story shows me is a lot of things. One, this is not black and white history. This is someone that I'm speaking to who's in her 60s and had had that experience in United States schools. Another thing that I see is the ways that Black children sometimes are kind of criminalized in schools for things that they don't understand, and they take that in. The fact that that is such a vivid memory for her 60 years later, that's a problem. And so that is a story that to me shows me the injustice of those things. However, in giving me that story, she also talked about how because of that experience, she always does what her mom did for her kids. So if something happens in school, she shows up. She goes to the principal. She talks to the teachers. She tries to get to know them, even if it like, and sometimes it does interfere with work schedules, and she's had to figure that out or find someone who can go for her. But because of that experience, she was like, I don't want that for my kids. And so I see both the injustice there, but I also see how she's using storytelling to talk about something that could be different or how she's trying to make things different for the next generation.
And there was a conversation that I had with a friend about the talk. I could never imagine. I have a teenage son, he's 19 years old, but I could never imagine having to have that conversation with him about an agency, a law enforcement that is supposed to protect us. But I really appreciated in having that conversation because it just opened up personally my eyes to things that I wasn't exposed to, and to again to the point of your work, it's important to have these conversations because one, you're seen, you're heard, but for members that are not people who are not members of that particular community, it's also very educational.
Yeah, I have actually had to have the talk with my son, and he was 8 when I had to have it, because he liked playing with, like the water guns that sometimes look a little too much like guns. And so I we had to have that talk after, like, especially during the protests, because he was afraid. He was telling me that he had seen some stuff. And he was like, I don't understand. And I was like, what don't you understand? He was like, are they going to kill me? And I was like, I don't think so. And it was one of those things where I couldn't say yes or no. And I felt that in my heart because I wanted to be like, no, 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 let me protect you from feeling that way. But also, there have been young Black boys who've been murdered too. And so I was like, well, I can't say yes or no. I'm like, I don't think so. And he's like, well, then are they going to murder you? And I was like, I don't think so. But like the fact that like I didn't go into like more of that conversation, but the fact that he noticed that before he even reached double digits, it's it's very saddening. And he's 11 now and still seeing things, and we've made it like an open communication about whatever it is that he ever wants to talk about, no matter what. But he's still grappling with that. Like, what does it mean? And how does he get to experience or express his joyful childhoodness? in a world that doesn't know how to see him as a child sometimes. And that's hard.
It's heartbreaking that we members of different communities feel the necessity, not even feel, it's just a need to have those conversations to protect our children, our most vulnerable. I'm going to turn the page. We publish at the Fulcrum a column titled that you wrote, "No Going Backwards Cannot Take Down DOE." You focused on the White House declaration to shut down the U.S. Department of Education, coupled with the executive order banning diversity initiatives, which, as you wrote, threatens to undo the progress so many Americans have fought to achieve in advancing educational equity. Tell us more about your piece.
So again, like I work in the teacher education space. I work in literacy. And so I think that stories are funny things. And there's been a history of stories that argue for a more efficient government. And I get that. Like I get that completely. But what exactly does that mean? And I think some folks may see like this efficiency as a streamlining, getting rid of the bloat, of getting rid of unnecessary things. But so many people consider those who are economically disadvantaged, elderly, disabled, people of color as those unnecessary things. And so when I saw the comment about like, oh, we need to end the Department of Education, I was like, that's going to affect those people that are considered the bloat. It's going to affect the people that's like, oh, well, you should have been pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The Department of Education, yeah, like there's a lot of things that could be fixed with it, but to close it closes down so many assistance programs that help so many people in this country and some that people may not even know about. And so that was one of my biggest things is really thinking about like what might happen if this thing closes? What might happen to the folks who may not realize like what the Department of Education actually controls? And so like I heard like, oh, well, there shouldn't be the Department of Education can close and we should push it back to the states so that the states can think about curriculum and the standards and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's what states do already. Like every state has its own group of standards. Every district uses different curriculum. Like it's not governed by the federal government. But what is covered by the Department of Education is things like Title One. So that's going to be those the funds that go to more high poverty areas, that's covered by the Department of Education. The Individuals with Disabilities Act is under the College of, or not College of Education, under the Department of Education. Title IX is under the Department of Education. And so those those laws that we have are there to protect young people. They're there to ensure that young people have access to an equal education, even if like there are definitely still problems with inequity in our education system, but the Department of Education is supposed to kind of help to balance that in whatever ways it can, knowing that it can't do everything. And but if that closes, it creates even more of an unbalance. I'll talk about where I worked. So I was a high school English teacher in both Tallahassee, Florida, and then DeKalb County, Georgia. And when I was in DeKalb County, I worked at what was designated a Title I school. And all that means is that the government provides extra assistance to make sure that the students who attend that school get the same or close to the same educational options as students who are in more affluent areas. And I remember being there and they knew it was a Title I school. But what it did was like it got computers for the students. It got us extra books so that we didn't have to use ones that were tattered and run down. It got us funding to take them on a field trip. And it wasn't a whole bunch of field trips. I think it was like one field trip, but we still got to do it. And so it gave them access to something that they might not have had otherwise. It gave them access to more high quality teachers because the district had the funds to pay the teachers what they needed to do the work that they needed to do. And I think about if the Department of Education closed, how much money would be removed from that school. And what would happen then is they would lose access to more books. We talk about like we need to focus on literacy in the country. And if we're not getting the funds to get books that students are interested in, then we lose that. If we, in a very highly technological society, we might need to get computers for students. If we don't have the funds to do that and we need students to get their own computers, they might not be able to do that. So then it creates another inequity. And so I just saw that as this domino effect that will affect so many places that are not affluent, that are filled with folks who look like me and some that don't. It will affect a lot of the places that we don't think about. I think um there are all these big cities that we think about all the time. So your Chicago's and your Atlanta's and San Francisco's and stuff like that. But then there are always those places that you drive by. They're like on the highway guide signs when you're trying to go elsewhere, and you're just like, ah, I saw the name of that. There are so many of those places that are going to be affected because they're not the big places. They're not the places with all the funding. They're not the places that have the capacity to handle what might happen if the Department of Education closes. Some places will be okay, and a lot of places won't. And so that's kind of where that article came from.
First of all, just the notion of shutting down the Department of Education, it comes from a privileged perspective, as if, and it rolls into the conversation of the Trump administration's attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and promoting meritocracy, as if both can't coexist. But
Yeah.
but more importantly, it is the notion that everybody figuratively starts at the starting line when that's simply not true, largely because of historic systemic issues that have kept marginalized communities behind, right? So nobody starts the race figuratively at the starting line. Many marginalized communities are starting a mile away. And so resources like what you described for the Department of Education and other is really to course correct situations in order to close the gap in regards to my oversimplistic example of starting at the starting line. But I think again that's the debate that we're having. As you are well aware, DEI has been politically weaponized, and I think all as you said, no one's saying there isn't an opportunity to improve the Department of Education, U.S. aid, but there's a difference between fixing what's broken and just shutting it down like a light switch from one day to the other with no consideration of the good some of these agencies are doing and then the impact of the people that are working because of those agencies.
Yes. Yes.
So you've mentioned a couple of times that you grew up in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. I wanted to learn more about your upbringing, the influence and inspiration that fuels the work that you lead today.
Yes. So growing up there, I thought that I lived in a black city, like a black city. And I thought that because I lived on the black side of town. I didn't know that when I was younger, but everyone that I lived around was black. And everybody on my school bus was black. And when I walked around the school, there was a lot of white students, but the people that I hung out around the most were the black students because they lived around me. And I didn't really see any discrepancies or anything or any inequalities until I got older and realized like, oh, well, in all my honors classes, it was me and a boy named Michael who were the only folks of color in the classrooms when we were taking honors classes. Um, I didn't see that when I was younger. But then now looking back, and I'm like, everybody I knew was black. Everybody on my school bus was black. There was a lot of black students in that school, but only two of us in the honors classes. And so like those things are things that I notice now. Um, I think growing up in that place kind of taught me a lot, but after I had moved. And I say that because when I was in 11th grade, we moved to Sanford, Florida. And that was the first time a guidance counselor or teacher brought up college to me. I had a 4.0 GPA. I had good attendance. I had community service hours. I had done all the things, and no one had ever brought up college. And so looking back again, I'm like, well, why not? Like, why wasn't I a person that the guidance counselors in Newcastle said, like, oh yeah, you should think about college, or even just hand me a brochure. So it was no nothing like that until I left. And so growing up there, I feel like I might have been a little bit stunted in my growth because I wonder like what could I have done? And I do feel like I'm where I want to be now. Like I'm not saying that, but I think about like who might I have been if I was encouraged earlier? What might I have tried to do if someone had approached me about the future well before I left? And so I think about that a lot, and I think it influences my work because I worry about the kids who are still there. Um, the work that I'm doing now is because I keep up with the city, and so I read the school district's comprehensive plans every time a new one comes out because I'm in education and I want to know like what's happening. I still have cousins who are in the district. And I saw when the 2019 one came out, and it was like it said that the school district had been failing in literacy and hasn't been able to make adequate yearly progress because of economically disadvantaged students and Black. And I was just like, why are you blaming us for this? Especially thinking about my experiences, thinking about what was open to me or not, thinking about um, how when I was in school, when we talked about, like I mentioned earlier, like if you don't have the books that young people want to read, I remember like I was an avid reader, but the books that I like to read were not considered literature enough for teachers. And so I was like, oh, well, you're a kind of reader. So like I think about that and I was just like, well, like why are you blaming us for this? When I feel like it's not that the young people are failures here, it's that the district is failing to help them do the things that need to be done. And so I talk about Newcastle a lot because I want it to be better. When I talked about Black storytelling and the ways that we can talk about the injustices, but also the things that we can do better, I think that I talk about Newcastle and some of the negative experiences that I had and others have as a way to be like, we can do better than this collectively. And so that's, I guess, how it influences my work is I want better for the folks who are there, but I also want better for the folks who are in places just like it that people don't see because they haven't lived there and they don't know any people there and it doesn't seem like it's of worth.
You're doing a wonderful job of lifting other people up in the work that you're doing and hope and helping them see beyond what perhaps they've been conditioned to see. I'm Stephanie Toliver, Assistant Professor of Curriculum and Instruction, focusing on English education and adolescent secondary literacy. Thank you so very much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you again for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation.
And thank you all for spending this time with us as well. Conversation and collaboration nurture a well-informed citizenry. Amugo Balta. Hasta la próxima.